So I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Darica Narvaez, who's a professor of psychology and director of the Collaborative for Ethical Education at the University of Notre Dame. Her research examines how early life experience influences moral functioning and moral character in children and adults, and she integrates neurobiological, clinical, developmental, and education sciences in her theories and research about moral development. Dr. Narvaez has developed several integrative theories, including most recently triune ethics theory. She's written dozens of research articles and chapters and is the author of 4 award-winning books. And finally, she's the organizer and chair of this great conference. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Narvaez.
Now I get to talk for a while. All right, we all have had experience with plants. We in elementary school remember how, oh, it's not, I'm sorry. We've all had experience with plants. I remember in elementary school where we tested, whether sunlight affected plants, and we learned, yes, you get a leggy, kind of not very good-looking plant when you deprive it of sun. And so there have been many, many kinds of experiments done on plants and find that certain sorts of elements are needed. Sun, soil, water, air. And when any of these are deficient, it can lead to stunted growth. There's susceptibility to illness and early death. And so we can talk about this as a developmental niche, which I've brought up yesterday, which people have defined as the reliable and repeatable features of stimulation and experience occurring in an organism's developmental context, or the set of ecological and social circumstances typically inherited by members of a species. Ontogenetic niche is another term. And we can see these factors as extragenetic. So they're not linked specifically to genes, at least as far as we can tell for now. And they form then a set of available resources that each generation provides to its young. From a developmental perspective, this is a recurrent set of practices or experiences from generation to generation of a set of specific developmental resources and interactions that make up that niche. And it serves really as a primary basis for the development and maintenance of species-typical behavior. So when you have a species-typical niche or developmental niche, you get resulting creatures or organisms that are species-typical. And so we can see that when we give plants what they love, crave, need, expect, you get beautiful plants. How does this apply to humans? So we've been hinting at it, we've been talking about it in different ways so far. And we know that humans are especially needy when they're born compared to other animals. We're really born, people talk about it 9 months early because we're not mobile yet. Or even 18 months early because the bones are so more like fetal bones compared to other animals that you could argue we're 18 months early. We only have 25% of brain volume developed at birth. That's full-term birth, 40 to 42 weeks. Many babies now are born before that time. And under normal circumstances with full-term birth, 80% of the brain is developed by age 3. And so for this very intense neediness, we have intensive parenting and exterogestation. So an external womb is required. So what's happening during this external womb period? Well, that body, mind, brain is being co-constructed by caregivers. We've been hearing about how that works epigenetically. It's a very developmentally plastic time period. And it's a dynamic process. This constructive interactionism, Susan Oyama's term, refers to the constant interaction between nature and nurture. Every moment of every day, the organism has changed And so the environment has a different effect on it, and the organism affects the environment, and how those interplay on so many levels through so many systems is ongoing and persistent. And so for all brain and body systems in early life, there are epigenetic and plasticity effects. And this includes emotion systems, what you find pleasurable, your social worldview. This is more in my area, right? The social moral development, and as well as the self, who you think you are and how you function with others. So when we ask what is evolved expected care, what is that developmental niche, we can say that we can find it going back 30 million years to the emergence of the catarrhine mammals, the social mammals, where those practices that I've been flashing at you, and that the book that's out now from the last symposium addresses, and includes these characteristics. So these specifically emerged 30 million years ago, except for the alloparents, which is more of a human variant. There are some animals who have multiple parents, but most do not. And then also the length of breastfeeding is also a little bit more variable among humans. But otherwise, those characteristics have been around so many millions of years. What's happening in the US? These are all decreasing over the 20th century. So instead of being held or touched, we have children pretty much isolated a lot in comparison, as I flashed pictures up earlier today. We have many people believing that it's all right for babies to cry. It's good for them, for their independence. We have low rates of breastfeeding, although recently in the last couple years it has ticked up. We have the belief that mom should be taking care of the child alone. That's sort of, isn't that the nuclear family? Isn't that the way it's supposed to be, when it's really only a recent invention? And we have a lot of schools that don't have recess anymore, elementary schools without recess. So play is being curtailed, and we have parents who are stress reactive and keep their children in when they hear, there might be a kidnapper on the corner, so how can you let your children out to play? And there's one study that showed that since 1970, parent allowance for play outside the home has shrunk to 1/9 of what it was in 1970, even though the crime rate is the same as that time period. And then we expect moms to do everything, work, take care of the child, balance all that on their own almost. And we have increasing rates of non-natural childbirth. Cesareans are still around 33% in the United States. So if we look at each of these, do they matter? Well, touch. Frances talked about the epigenetics of touch. And she and Michael Meany in his lab for 20 years now, I think, almost, have shown that it affects whether you have the glucocorticoids receptor proteins in the hippocampus turned on or off, depending on whether you have the high grooming or low grooming mother. And this persists for life unless there's a a pharmaceutical intervention. We know that growth is affected by touch, that DNA synthesis stops, growth hormone stops when babies are separated. Hofer showed a whole bunch of different systems kind of get dysregulated when the offspring is separated from the mammalian mother. Responsivity is affecting the child's stress reactivity. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal gland axis. And it also affects, well, there's different ways of measuring stress. Another one is vagal tone. Vagal tone, the vagal nerve is connected to all sorts of systems in the body, including cardiac, respiratory, digestion, immune system. And if you don't have a parent who comforts you as a newborn, as a young child, then your vagal nerve doesn't get set right. Your vagal tone never gets established well, and so you're susceptible to irritable bowel or seizures, different things that the vagus nerve has some control over. And if we look at breastfeeding, we know there's a number of studies that show that it affects intelligence and health. For example, here's a recent chart from a government document showing how much more risk there is if you don't breastfeed. So these are the risk effects for not breastfeeding. So 100% higher risk for acute ear infections, 178% higher for diarrhea and vomiting, hospitalization in the first year, 257% higher risk, and so on. You can see asthma here, obesity, type 2 diabetes, leukemia, and SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So then if we look at alloparents, we know from Sarah Hurdy's review that if you have multiple adult caregivers in early life, you're more open. And you have, as the mother, as an infant or a child, you're more open, but the mother is more responsive to her offspring when there's social support. And Frances mentioned that's true for the rats too when they breed in the wild. Play, if you have free, self-directed play, you have more self-control. It's linked to not getting ADHD. You have greater social skills. Social support, greater health and well-being from that. So there are a number of studies there. And then for natural childbirth, we know it affects bonding. Even a year later, the self-regulation and bonding is varied in experiments that have been done. Intelligence is affected by cesarean C-sections. There's certain factors that are not stimulated when there's a C-section that vaginal birth does stimulate, and immune system similarly. So there's a lot going on here, and we know that they're all related to self-regulation and well-being. But they're decreasing, as I said, in the USA, generally. And this book talks about all of them. Again, I'm highlighting your book. Get a flyer out there. You can order it at a discount. So we have early experience setting up all sorts of things, the stress response. And when you don't get what you need in that early life, and we're still trying to figure out what you need when, you have an overreactive stress response. So if your mother's overly stressed during fetal development or postnatally or even during birth, you can end up with an overreactive stress response. Your immune system is set up, and it can be suppressed then by too much stress or not enough touch or not enough care. And the T-cell ratios can be not as optimal. The endocrine system can be malformed, so oxytocin systems and other types. Neurotransmitters also are affected, their number, their function, serotonin receptors, for example, which operate, I guess, mostly in the gut. But they are also affected by how much attention in this developmental niche you are receiving. Emotions and motion systems are also underdeveloped. The corpus callosum, Martin Teicher at Harvard has pointed out that both the corpus callosum in neglected boys and brain hemispheric integration are affected by neglect, especially in males, but in all kids. So what we end up with is we have gaps or lesions in multiple brain systems, and these we know occur with trauma, abuse, or neglect. And my concern is that undercare, the lack of this developmental niche, is also a toxic stress, a form of toxic stress. So you can see that, for example, the effects on a 3-year-old brain of normal development and then extreme neglect, you can see that there's actual neuronal, the brain just doesn't grow in the way it should by age 3. So inadequate early care is toxic. It undermines physiological and psychological functioning, creating all sorts of inadequacies in brain structures, hormones, and other systems that we know lead to social functioning and sociality. And right now we have epidemics of anxiety, depression among all age groups. And these things are increasing among college students. So college student empathy has dropped in the last decade significantly, has been trending down for decades. College student avoidant attachment is up in the last decade. College student mental health disorders are up. And so we have some issues. You can see here how stress, this is a recent paper just out, stress changes gene expression, which alters synapses. So in depressed people who we assume here didn't get the developmental niche they required, you can see that the synapses themselves are affected, and that's going to affect all sorts of brain function. So my concern is that if we're not providing the species typical developmental niche, we're providing atypical developmental niche, and we should not be surprised that we're having all these psychopathological problems among our children and adults that are really falling outside the normal range for our species. That's my argument. You'll probably argue with me. By the way, I would love it if anybody in the audience would take notes. If you have suggestions for me, since this is interdisciplinary work, it's risky and it's, I'm not the expert in any of these areas really, because I'm in moral development. So if you have suggestions for me, please write them down and give it to me. I'd be so thrilled. Anybody in the audience? So again, I showed this earlier, but you can see that developmental disabilities are increasing in children instead of going the other way around in the wealthiest, richest nation of the world. So these are massive concerns that we've got since 1997 to 2008, these periods, we've got these increases, 17% greater incidence of developmental disabilities, including ADHD, autism, even blindness, hearing loss, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, well, not that, sorry, and seizures, stuttering, and other developmental delays. So I guess hearing loss too, I mistakenly marked. That's a negative there. All right, so how is this actually related to moral functioning, which is my extreme interest, since I think that's one of our inheritances that Franz de Waal talked to us about. Among other animals, we can see moral functioning everywhere. I use a generous definition of what that means. Does early experience matter? Well, we're trying to find that out. But we know, this is what we know right now, is that early life sets the stage for social moral development. So Broznia-Kohanska has done the most significant long-term work showing that mutually responsive orientation, so the parent who's mutually responsive allows the child to have an influence on her or him and influences the child. There's a back and forth relationship. That leads to a secure attachment, and both of these together lead to all sorts of good things for social functioning and moral functioning. Empathy, self-regulation, conscience, having a sense of guilt or concern after wrongdoing, openness to others. This is Greenspan and Shaker's work. And then also we find that there's a sense of agency and self-efficacy that also develops from this kind of social environment in early life. So we know responsiveness is key. We all know that, right? Responsiveness is a good thing. So we're doing work now, Family Life Project. These are my esteemed colleagues. Jennifer Lefevre is here in the audience to help me if I get lost. Thank you, Jennifer. And then I have Peggy and Allison here at Notre Dame and Tracy Gleason at Wellesley. So what we're trying to do now is study the effects of these practices on child outcomes. And we have a series of studies that we're conducting. We call it the Family Life Project. There are 5 studies I'm going to mention to you. I'm sorry about that. Maybe you'll fall asleep on me. I'll try to keep track. We have a longitudinal study with other people's data. And then we've developed our own measure, and we've tested it in China, the USA, and then done some subsequent additional analyses. And then we also have another set of questions I'll mention. Study 1 then is longitudinal, so we're looking at an existing data set, and we extract where we can some of these, what practices we could find in the data set. So breastfeeding, and it turns out to be initiation. There were too few people on length, although because they asked it retrospectively. And maternal responsivity with a home observation, touch through an interview process, social support, And then the child outcomes that maternal reports provided included behavior regulation, social engagement, cooperation, behavior problems, so that's internalizing, externalizing, so that's depressive and aggressive behaviors, competence, and cognitive development. And in this study, it was a broad-based study emphasizing adolescents and low-income mother-child pairs. And you can see that there's a mean age of 17 in the adolescents. And then lower education adults were 169 and 117 with higher education. And a large African-American contingent. The procedure was to test the mothers and children at these time points. So you can see it's quite a long study here. And again, we extracted these questions and we looked at these outcomes for kids. Oh, that didn't come out very well. But you can see, the only point to put this up is to show you that there's a lot of stuff that was significantly correlated. So between the child behavior outcomes here and the maternal behavior. So hopefully the next one will be fine. Okay. Now this is with controls. We controlled for mothers' income and age and previous time point. Unless there's a plus, that means only age and income. And so you can see that behavior regulation at 18 months and 30 months of age are related to mother's responsivity, and as well as positive touch. And then you can see that child's social engagement at 18 and 30 was related to mother's positive touch. Cooperation of the child related to responsivity and social support. Not externalizing and not being aggressive is related to breastfeeding, just even trying to breastfeed. It's also, externalizing is also related to responsivity and social support at different time points. And then not being depressed is related to responsivity here. Competence, child's competence, related to various things, and then cognitive development as well. So you see the pattern is not easy to interpret, but we're finding effects. And so here is this is after controlling, again, for the previous time point, and you can see that the overall, it mattered whether you tried to breastfeed or not for pro-social behaviors at 18 months and for behavior problems at 24 months. You can see that touch matters at 4 months. And we found that the mothers who were especially touchy at 4 months and stayed touchy, they had greater effects over time. So it's the lack of decline in touch or less decline in touching affected behavior problems later and cognitive ability. Then social support also matters for pro-social behaviors, behavior problems, and cognitive ability. I'm going to show you this in another form. So this is responsivity. And let me say this more precisely. So longitudinal trajectories revealed that maternal responsivity gradually increased over time, starting at 4 months, reaching a peak at 18 months before dropping slightly at 30 months. And we fit a latent growth curve model for maternal responsivity consisting of correlated intercept, that's the maternal responsivity at 4 months, and change factors, the change between maternal responsivity between 4 and 30 months, which resulted in a good fit. Then we fit the structural equation model to study the impact of maternal responsivity on the latent child outcome variables, controlling for the 2 background covariates. And so you can see then that cooperation is affected by responsivity at 4 months, but also had was affecting cooperation at 30 months, as well as responsivity at later time points. And here's another model showing that social support early mattered for cooperation at 18 months, which affected cooperation later, but social support later is not what's predicting, so there's a mediation here. Similarly, for externalizing behaviors, that's aggression. You can see that early social support matters. For later, it's mediating well, it affects early aggressive behaviors, which affect later behaviors. Social support also, again, that early experience, that early social support is affecting competence early on, which affects competence later. And positive touch, we have similar effects. The early experience of positive touch is what is predictive of behavior regulation at 18 months, and that's what's predicting 30 months behavior regulation. Similarly, although here we have an effect of positive touch not only on social engagement at 30 months, but also at social engagement at, 18 months, but also at 30 months. So you can see things are complicated. So we're happy that we found effects over time. And here's another kind of, in a nutshell, what we found. Breastfeeding initiation, we have less aggression at age 2. Positive touch, greater intelligence and social engagement at age 3. Maternal social support, we have less aggression and more social competence at 24 months. Greater cooperation at 18 and 30 months. So we think there's something to this developmental niche. And we should say also that maternal responsivity seems to be set by 4 months. Other people have found this also. Feldman, I think Ainsworth did as well. That early experience with a child, the mother-child, they set up the relationship, and by 4 months, it's pretty set. So that's why perhaps that early social support is so important. Our second study was in China with Chinese mothers, where we developed our family life attitudes and behavior measure, asking them about their behavior and attitudes towards each of the parenting practices that form the developmental niche. And then we used reliable child outcome measures, maternal reports from My Child, Kahanska's, a set of measures, and the child behavior questionnaire. And here you can see that we found a number of effects. So breastfeeding length overall was affected inhibitory control at age 3. So this is all age 3-year-olds. And this is the mothers reporting at age 3, what they did and what they believed. So this is what they did, of course. So breastfeeding length affected conscience development, guilt, and concern. Their attitudes were not significant here. Touch behavior when the child was a baby affected several outcomes, including inhibitory control, self-regulation, empathy. Touch behavior now as a 3-year-old that they reported affected those 3 plus concern after wrongdoing. And attitudes also had an effect on inhibitory control. And then you can see that the number of caregivers, there was a linear effect on concern after wrongdoing. The number of, we found that though that you could have too many caregivers in China. And so if you had too many, there's actually a decrease in self-regulation and guilt. So it matters how many you have, apparently. And then number of non-caregivers had an effect too. So exposure to multiple caregivers matters for inhibitory control. And we asked them about what kind of family cohesive behavior, that social support within the family they had, and there's an effect on the behavior regulation variables, as well as empathy and concern after wrongdoing. Then you see there's the play. We asked about play with mom, play with other adults, and how much they did that. And you can see that there are also effects here, significant effects. And then attitudes about play also mattered. And then childbirth attitudes mattered too. We did find that self-regulation was related to actual C-section. It's not on this chart, but C-sections were related to 3-year-olds having less self-regulation. So we find that there are significant effects or significant role for developmental niche practices for behavior regulation, empathy, and conscience. And we think the pattern suggests that each practice contributes to moral development in a different way, and they do contribute beyond responsivity alone. Our USA study was the same setup, except we used mothers in the United States, same types of questions. And you can see we have similar findings, although there were fewer findings in the USA. Sorry, it didn't remove the non-significant ones. But you see breastfeeding choice is related to inhibitory control. This is not significant. But So it is kind of hard to tell the bolded things. But anyway, touch behavior is related to inhibitory control, empathy, touch behavior in infancy and now. So there's significant effects here. And then you can see touch attitudes even matter. And maternal responsivity that's reported by the mother is also significant for these variables. And closeness of kin, we found some significance there. Family routines as well, play, but it's just not as significant overall as in China. Our fourth study was comparing touch effects in China and the USA. So what we asked them about was positive and negative touch. So questions like positive ones would be, I cuddled and kissed and hugged my child as a baby, or I do that now. And the negative item would be, I slapped or hit or pinched the child as a baby when needed, or now when needed. And here's the response scale. And then again, we have the standardized measures of child development, the same ones. And here, these are preliminary results. These are after controlling for maternal age, income, and responsivity. These are the findings then. We find that positive touch is related to empathy development, age 3. Lack of negative touch, also related to empathy in the USA. And then you see inhibitory control is also significantly predicted. In China, more things are predicted. So we have the empathy results that are similar, but also concern after wrongdoing, self-regulation, and inhibitory control. So general findings across studies, if we look at each of these components again, natural childbirth, and here no C-section is what we're looking at. We know that that can influence breastfeeding success, immune system development, stress reactivity, cognitive vigilance. If you receive gastric suction at birth, you end up more likely to have cognitive vigilance as a kind of wired into your brain. But in terms of C-section, there's a relation to empathy at age 3 and self-regulation. And breastfeeding, you can see that it affects all sorts of things physiologically and also mental well-being. In our studies, then in this last column, we find that there's an effect on prosocial behavior, behavior problems for breastfeeding initiation, but also for breastfeeding length, inhibitory control and conscience development. For positive touch, we know that it influences growth of personality. Physiologically, it affects all sorts of things. And we know that these things are indirectly related to mental health. And then our findings here, touch and infancy are related to several factors, and then touch now related to several factors that contribute to moral functioning. Caregiver responsivity, that influences all sorts of child outcomes and has an effect, again, on multiple physiological systems and affects mental health in all sorts of ways. And then here's our findings again. So there's a lot of things that are related to moral functioning. Free play, it affects all sorts of systems and tune-up. Physical health effects, I didn't put anything here for some reason, but I guess in early life, I'm not quite sure. And then mental health effects. We know that there's social skills later. And then our effects here. So play with mom, play with adults, and then we have to ask play with other kids. And then multiple adult caregivers and social support, we find is affects of maternal support, has indirect effects on all child outcomes. And then our findings with multiple adult caregivers, we find a couple things here. And then social support, maternal reported social support is affecting these outcomes. Here's another way to put that information. The gray means that we didn't test it. So we can see then that natural childbirth is affecting empathy and self-regulation, breastfeeding initiation, affects conscience, cooperation, and not being aggressive, breastfeeding length, multiple, these two is conscience, self-regulation, touch, as multiple, responsivity across the board, right? We can measure that one more easily, I think. And then play and social support or multiple caregivers. One of the challenges is how to measure and how to get at the actual behavior. You'd have to hang out with the family for 24 hours for a day for several weeks to figure out what's going on. But using the questionnaire, we were happy that we could find results. Our last study here then that I'm talking about is nurturing parenting attitudes. We have preliminary data here. These are moms of 3 to 5-year-olds, online study. And we revised several of our attitude measures, and we included then a measure of social moral orientation. So how much that child is oriented to relationships, a concern for social consideration when they're with others. Do they have social imagination when they play with others? Or are they oppositional, distrustful, or withdrawing when they're with others? And we had several models that we fit. So we first fit a model on a latent factor of nurturing parenting, which fit very well. And then we developed latent models for child outcomes, so mental health problems. This was a good fitting model, and I don't have the numbers there, but you can ask me about it. We had a saturated model for antisocial behavior. So this is the oppositional. When they're with others, are they oppositional? Do they misbehave? Are they distrustful? And then for the flourishing, the socio-moral flourishing, which is the aim of all this, how did that affect? Well, there's great effects also here for a set of variables called happiness, social consideration, social attunement, imagination, and empathy. So in my view, early caregiving affects early formation, influencing well-being and moral nature, and all sorts of health aspects, habits, and worldview, which is what I look at in college students and adults. But what this developmental niche does, it really tunes us up for this, what I call the ethic of engagement, the ability to be emotionally intimate with others, to be present emotionally with others, not governed by fear and past experience of trauma. And this is actually these instincts that are when in the developmental niche that we saw from Franz's research with primates developed normally in that developmental niche. And Darwin called it the moral sense, this ability to really be responsive to others and have empathy in the moment and act for others. We know it's primed by secure attachment, Trevarthen's intersubjectivity, and this is focused on the present moment. It's built from the emotion systems of the upper limbic system, the care mammalian system, the play mammalian system. They're in caps because they have been mapped out in mammalian brains. And we know that they're related to all these wonderful behaviors that we expect of well-functioning adults. So in my view, when you have a typical niche, that's what you find. But when you have an atypical niche, which we have now apparently, what happens? You have a different type of ethic then. You develop a relational self-protection orientation based primarily in survival mechanisms being enhanced by stress, by neglect, by undercare. And we share these systems, and we're born with them at birth. They're in the brainstem, in the lower limbic system. They're primed by perceptions of fearful climates or situations. So they're threat reactive, and they kick in when we feel under threat. The stress response kicks in, shuts down higher cognition, shuts down our compassion, shifts our attention to the self, mobilizes us for fight, flight, or freeze. It lowers our empathy, and it's useful for moments of physical threat, but if it's a long-term personality, it's pathological. And there's two types here. You can have what I call a bunker morality, which is really that fight orientation, being aggressive. So aggressive kids feel like everyone's out to get them, so if someone accidentally bumps into them, they perceive it as intentional. So they have a high stress response that's kind of on all the time. And we can see that in this mode, we all feel like, oh, that's right, somebody cut you off in traffic, I'm going to get them back, right? It's that, we all can fall into it. And it's helpful when there's a predator after you, right? Or something. But if early trauma and early neglect can make it a personality disposition, and it's linked to these ambivalent anxious attachment styles, emotion systems that are enhanced then from not fostering the care and play systems, then what happens is it seems that the seeking and rage systems are more enhanced, and we can see bullying, abuse, blaming. The other one, and you can flip between them, stay in one, or flip between these two self-protective modes. This is what I call wallflower morality, a freezing, kind of dissociative flight, and it's based in the parasympathetic systems of self-protective from psychological and physical trauma. So it's when you're submissive and passive and detached. You're compliant with an authority. It's the self-preservational internalizing orientation when it's a personality. And so early trauma, again, can push you into this kind of disposition. And what's enhanced here is the fear response and the separation distress. And you can see this then in multiple pathological behaviors, compulsiveness of various types, obsessiveness, hoarding, withdrawal paralysis. And this is the triune ethics. It's actually now called a multiple ethics theory because there's too many subtypes. But you can see that over here is the engagement ethic. This really relies on good right brain development. And when you don't have in my view, from what I understand, of all the neuroscience and neurodevelopment and the relation of parenting to right brain development, because it happens so much before age 2, before age 3. If you don't have the developmental niche that I'm talking about, I think this right brain development is underdeveloped. So Alan Shore writes about this a lot. So this is where we should be, but we're spending our time over here now, which is based in our trauma, so that when you see something threatening, it's actually your past history that's taking over your mind in the present. You've got to protect yourself. And that, again, shuts down your imagination for other things. And what happens then is you are a bunker, if that's immediate reactive aggression, reactive withdrawal, or else you can use your abstract thinking to planfully be aggressive or planfully be detached. And so there's ways to use your higher order cognitive systems, but still be in this very self-protective mode. How do we get there? Well, humans are the only animals that deny the young what they need. How did we get here? Well, I think it's a vicious cycle because we're all kind of over here on the left and we think that's normal. This is the full model, so this is objectively the moral zone. All religions, mainstream religions say compassion is the major value. That's the primary virtue in life. That's over here. It's being hospitable, tolerant, and kind to others, and using your imagination, your abstracting capabilities to foster that kind of compassionate response. I call it mindful morality. So in our ancestral nomadic forager life, and if you think of the human genus as a whole, it's 99% of our history. And Barry this morning talked a little bit about nomadic forager life, how they believe in egalitarianism and sharing and generosity. And if you read, I've been reading a lot of different reports of these groups, they have a subjectivity of all. Everything is an agent, not just humans. The tree, the mountain has agency, and they feel connected to all of it. They have an intersubjectivity with other life forms, a sense of harmony. And you can see that they spend most of their time in an engagement ethic. They spend a lot of time in music and dance, song, laughter, which I wonder isn't part of that moral sense or foster the moral sense. Think of all the hormones that are going on that are fostered by all that touching and dancing and laughing. It's a different set. And they also then have more capacities for this imaginative right brain higher consciousness, which is much more common in among those groups than we see in the West. So we can see that the neurobiology of early experience and during sensitive periods, so there are other times, like early adolescence is another time when the brain kind of regroups. So there are other times when you can redo things, as Francis was pointing out too. Leads to a personality, agreeableness, empathic orientation. These are characteristics of adult exemplars, people who take moral action, who are awarded or honored for their moral action as adults, and they have these characteristics. And hopefully you have an engagement ethic rather than a self-protective one. But this is what I think we're doing in our country now, in the USA, and in Western life in general, but especially in the USA, we're really emphasizing the safety ethic, the self-protection orientation. We use our imaginations. I mean, I'm making big generalizations here, I'm sorry. But I know this doesn't refer to you. But our culture emphasizes self-protection. We use our imaginations for our own gain, and we're encouraged to do that. We do that in school, right? Kids are encouraged to detach from their emotions and think about achieving. It's not every school, of course, not the Montessori school. But our media foster a vicious imagination, an emotionally detached imagination, and our engagement ethic is, because of our parenting, is in our culture has kind of decreased. I'm worried about that. And so what we think is normal is hierarchy and status and dominance and an alienation from nature is, something we watch on TV, I suppose. And what the Asians call this is a hungry ghost. So we have a different baseline in the West. I like this quote from Marshall Sahlins. He says, natural self-interest, because that's what we think is normal, right? For the greater part of humanity, self-interest as we know it is unnatural in the normative sense. It's considered madness, witchcraft, or some such grounds for ostracism, execution, or at least therapy. Rather than expressing a pre-social human nature, such avarice is generally taken for a loss of humanity. So the question is, which moral sense are we going to cultivate? Is it going to be the one that seems to be dominant now in the States, which is solo pleasure and detachment from relationships? We have more adults living alone now. 50% of the adult population live in single households, single adult households. Is it more an ethic of self-concern, of dysregulation, of self-interest, competition, egoism, which is Ayn Randism, which is kind of on the rise, and concern with purity and group dominance, those kinds of things? Or do we want to go back? And we have it in us, right? This moral sense that Darwin identified of social pleasure, empathy, social concern, habit control. These are the characteristics he identified. The interdependence we have with one another and other animals. The mutual relationship with the earth, cooperation, compassion, and concern with reciprocity and egalitarian respect. So in conclusion, I leave you with a question, but the conclusion is early toxic stress, this is my view, undermines health and well-being. This is really not debatable. And I argue it also undermines our morality. It pushes us to lower levels of ethics, so egoism, and we begin to think that it's universal human nature. But we really can't assume, this is now another additional point, frosting on the cherry on the cake. I think we can't assume that Western brains represent full human capacities. So we shouldn't be basing our conclusions about human nature on Western brains, since they were not developed in the developmental niche, unless we identify which ones were. And as a result, our moral development may be compromised, our moral functioning as well. I have a book that hopefully will be out next year that's all about this, so please do help me with it, with your expertise. And I have a Psychology Today blog where I rant about these things for parents and others. Thank you. I guess I can be in control of my own questions. Find a microphone, though. There's ones, standing ones, too. Turn it on. Turn it on.
A neonatologist here in South Bend. And NICUs are probably the epitome of this toxin. But I wonder, having done this now for more than 30 years and seeing some of my kids grow up, if this was a dose-related toxin, how do so many NICU kids turn out so surprisingly well? I mean, it's a question I ask myself because I talk about these same things about what a toxic environment we live in, and yet our kids really do pretty well, at least by Western standards.
Great question. Well, in my view, again, the baseline is slipped. What we think is adequate for success, and I'll put this in stark terms, is if a child doesn't end up in prison or drop out or teen pregnancy, that somehow is successful. Whereas I think my level of what I would like to push for is developmental, what I call developmental optimization. How do we ensure that we actually reach our fullest capacities for social relationships? Right now, we have very limited, minimal, I think, standards for what those are. And it's been fine because we've been slipping down and away. So I'd rather be in a world where people are compassionate. I know my neighbors and they care about me, and but in a way, because I think we have more avoidant attachment, we don't want all that closeness, right? We kind of push people back, because I grew up that way too. So, but I'd rather be in that hunter-gatherer kind of environment of, not going back to living outside, but in that communal, supportive, what children need and moms need is that community that comes around and encourages and says, oh, we're so excited you're pregnant. Oh, I can't wait for the baby. Oh, let me hold the baby, all that. We're missing it. It's like we expect babies to go to daycare at 6 weeks old. So somehow our standards have dropped so far, for me, that a child maybe gets through school all right, but I don't think that's enough.
Hi, Gene Halton, sociology here. I'd like to put the fun back in dysfunctional and play devil's advocate, not my opinion, but just devil's advocate. Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, who did so much for nutrition in America, said, devil's advocate, the organization does not serve the individual serves the organization. And Mao Zedong said, if you want to make an omelet, sometimes you have to crack a couple of eggs. Narcissistic disturbance, clinical narcissistic disturbance, is characterized by disabled empathy, but unimpaired cognitive functioning or even enhanced cognitive functions. It works well for our society today.
Example?
If you're not empathic and you can calculate really well, if you're going to wipe out businesses and mortgages and homes on Wall Street, you can do really well. And so I'm wondering if we're assuming the well-being of the child would fit with the well-being of society. If our society has pathological dictates, can we just assume the well-being of individuals can fit with that society? Do we have to address the institutional levels? Aldous Huxley in Brave New World showed a society with 5 tiers where it was both genetic cloning and conditioning with alcohol put into the decanters of the kids. They were not naturally born, they were decanted. And when they had tried to make an all-alpha society, it didn't work out. They needed different tiers by disabling in different ways. Could we look at these kind of pathologies as the way our society structurally creates disablements that work for the pathological or alienated requirements of the society?
I think that's the usual argument, yes, that like in developmental psychology, it's just another phenotype, what's the big deal, right? Well, one thing I didn't mention is I have also a broader perspective of the earth, the environment, us, nature, and what we're doing now is destroying our habitat. And I think it's in part because we don't have that empathy for other creatures, other life forms, or other people across the earth. And we've lost so in a way we have handicapped brains, because if you read about what the capabilities of the hunter-gatherers are, it's just amazing. I mean, they see better, they hear better, they can, they understand what's going on much better than we can. We're sort of robotic now in comparison because of our lack of development. But let's go, yes.
Yes, I wanted to say something about success. I've just started teaching at Ivy Tech in Kokomo and Logansport, and I'm amazed at the number of my students who are like working full-time, going to school full-time, and have kids, and are like think this is a good thing, that this is what it means to be successful when you're balancing all these things. They talk about that they never get more than 4 hours sleep, and I don't know how they're reacting when I try to say that's not healthy. You're paying the cost. You need balance in your life, things like that. So again, you know, workaholism is encouraged in the society. You're considered successful if you can achieve, achieve, achieve. So I just wanted to mention that. And then I wanted to ask, because I'm not sure, I mean, I haven't really read about what people are saying about how to apply alloparenting to our culture, because I hope they're not saying, so daycare is great because now you've got more caregivers, because it's a totally different situation when, you know, you have other caregivers in a hunter-gatherer society where it's the older child. If the baby gets fussy, takes to the mom. It's like, I believe most of the time mom is available. So that's a huge difference with, you know, with daycare, where the turnover, they have, you know, you might have a different teacher or caregiver every 3 months because they're being replaced. Just the whole idea it's an institution, the ratio. So can you comment on that, on whether people are trying to say daycare is good because now you've got multiple caregivers? Because to me, it's a totally different situation.
Right, I bet other people could speak better to that than I, but daycare, usually, I guess, I don't know what the figure is, 90% of daycares are not that great, in part because they have too many kids for the number of adults. I think the ratio is shifted, so in hunter-gatherer communities, it's more adults to a child, whereas in daycare centers now, it's more kids to an adult. And so you just can't be as responsive to the needs of the child, and they're not going to carry around 4 babies if they're caring for 4 babies, right? And just impossible, 1 person for 4 babies. So, and that's a good number, I think. Some of the daycares, right? But maybe some of the practitioners can say something more about that. Wait,
the NICHD study of early child care, because we did have a huge national effort to try to address exactly those concerns.
about daycare.
About daycare, yes. And so it's you know, a study from birth to now age 15. They have multiple videotape data, multiple assessments all the way along, very good assessments of the quality of care, the extent of care, whether it was same kin care, families chose whatever care they wanted. It was 12 sites in the US. I was not a PI on this, so I can speak from outside. But I think the results have been surprising to most of us who are very concerned about daycare. And I mean, people were very careful, and there were different political views within this spectrum of investigators as well. It's been hard to document dramatic effects of daycare on negative effects. It looks as though if they're longer hour, well, several things. If there's a worse relationship with the parent, there's an interaction then with bad quality daycare to get even worse results for the kids than additive effects would lead you to expect. And as into the middle school years, it looks like the long time in daycare, long hours in daycare begins to have an effect on aggressive behavior. But they're much milder than we would have thought. And we do have to remember that these are children who go home to their parents. And what has predicted over time many, many of these outcomes is the quality of the relationship with the parent. So at least one part of this data has been to underscore how important that primary emotional relationship is in the child's life. And I'm hoping they're going to continue this into young adulthood, because you're in a very sheltered, structured environment during your school age years, and you don't have to function as an independent adult and really use all the internalized resources that are available. So I think it'll be a mistake if they don't get these kids into sort of adult functioning. But at least we do have a lot of data from that study that we need to reference in the debate.
One of the things that this reminds me of, though, is what are they measuring? Elkin and Goldberg, a specialist in the prefrontal cortex, says if you give frontal damage patients what he calls veridical tasks, where they just have to do a multiple choice test, they do fine. But it's when they have to do adaptive decision making, when they're in the real world and they have to negotiate, relationships and what to pay attention to. That's where you see the deficit. And I think that's where we see the deficit for morality. We don't see it on paper and pencil tests. It's whether you can actually figure out what to do right now in this situation in the right way. The virtue, what Aristotle calls virtue.
Yes, I mean, I'm not on the side of arguing for
No,
extensive
I know.
daycare
I'm
for
just
sure,
saying.
But I mean, these were looking at peer interactions in the classroom, looking at interaction with parents, I mean, these were multiple, very well, I mean, it was the best we have in terms of
Yeah.
developmental methodology. So we may need much better developmental methodology, which is quite likely to be the case in terms of social emotional
But thank you
function.
for bringing that up. That's good. Behind you. Didn't mean to jump on you, Carla.
Ami Young. I'm all but thesis master's in sociology at Cleveland State University, and talking about how to make the alloparenting work in modern America. There's one right out there with my 2-year-old who's been with me since he was 3 months old. I have actually 3 that my family, my husband and I are of enough means that we can keep them from starving and keep, they have gasoline and can pay their car insurance, but not much more. And that enables them to have the freedom to come and be with our children, but I'm not really paying them. On what you were saying, one thing that I noticed about that study that you're talking about, there wasn't a supportive mother at home. There was no cohort to compare with of women that were supporting each other or that had support while they were taking care of their own children, which is the situation that I've very intentionally created for myself, partially based on what I know from research and studying. I mommy tracked for 10 years. I took 10 years between my bachelor's and my master's starting, so I did a lot of reading in that time when I had my first and my second child. And I didn't have these allo parents in my life until I was pregnant with my 3rd. And it makes such a difference. I see such a difference in my 2-year-old compared to my other ones. And that's including with my mother-in-law and my father-in-law moved in before my 2nd was born. But being on the same page of we're all caring for this child and they respect my kind of paleo parenting mindset. Babies don't cry, they are tended to, they are held, they are breastfed on demand into toddlerhood, all that. It makes a difference, but it also makes a difference in how responsive I am to them and the quality of development in my children, that I have somebody with me, that I'm not alone with the kids, because it's making me so much more mentally healthy than I was when I was alone with the kids during the day all day. So I think that might explain some of the outcome differences with the corporate daycare, because they have a break. They've got a colleague that can watch the class while they go to the bathroom, whereas an at-home mom doesn't have that. I remember going to the bathroom with my baby in a sling because I didn't want to leave him crying while I used the bathroom. And that was really hard, especially because I've got physical issues with it. And it's hard enough for an able-bodied mom to do that. So these are issues that aren't being addressed, that our ancestors had these taken care of. And I think that a lot of our postpartum depression that we're seeing is because of that lack of support. And some women are getting smart about it and hiring doulas, but it's not an option that's out there enough that we can even research it. So that's something that really needs to be kept in mind as a criticism of some of these research outputs.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And, sometimes studies aren't looking at the right control group. That reminds me of the recent pediatrics publication on sleep training, right, where they looked at, so they trained half of 273 mothers, I think, or parents to sleep train in a certain way, and then there was a control group of half of them. And then 5 years later, they looked at depression in the children and found no difference. They didn't tell us, it doesn't say, at least in what we can read now, what control parents were doing, right? So we don't know what the real comparison is.
I was just going to say that mostly what this lady mentioned, oh, and I forgot to say, my name's Maureen McCarthy. I'm with the Infant Advocacy Center. That she was talking about school-age kids. To me, that's like a total different universe to talk about daycare for school-age kids than to talk about for babies and toddlers. Up to 2.5 years, up to 3 years of age. That's where children mostly need to be with their mothers, and they're being cared for by people. Okay, but it's like I mean, and I believe there are studies that show it's detrimental, that, you know, young children are more aggressive and so on. And also, those babies are not being cared for by someone who's in love with them. You know, they're not invested in them. So again, it's different when it's being cared for by an older brother or a grandparent or a good friend than an employee who's getting minimum wage and you know, is not going to stay there very long. So, yeah. This country gives lip service to valuing its children, but the lowest paid things are all things that have to do with children. You know, whether it's, I mean, mothers are not supported if they want to stay home, you know, financially. You know, babysitters, daycare workers, you know, early childhood teachers. So,
I just wanted to add the statistic
Is it
that.
on?
Pardon me?
Is it on? Oh,
I think so.
Hold it higher.
Okay. 20% of all sudden infant death syndrome deaths occur during the first 3 weeks that a baby less than 3 months of age is put in a daycare. That's a statistic that most Americans don't know. And that's just an unbelievable number. There is an NICHD project going on now to find out why these babies die. But
Can you say the numbers again?
it's 20% of diagnosed sudden infant death syndromes, with most of the deaths occurring within the first 3 weeks that the baby is placed. That's not a made-up or a politically correct number given the situation. Yes. Yeah. So I guess the main point is that's, one, people should know that, but secondly, there's something very different, as I, supporting this woman's comment, that a neonate and a very young baby is in a very different place developmentally than even a 5 to 6 month old.
Adam, yeah, one. Turn it on.
Well, I just, because this has sort of been a theme running through several people's questions, but, turn it on. Oh, it's not on. Yeah. Okay. Well, as I understood your HLM charts you had, or diagrams you had, a variable you didn't discuss, that would be an important intracultural variable, I mean, in terms of variation in parenting, was income, and it positively predicted nurturant parenting. And I just wanted to know if you had thought about that, or would you guys write about that? You controlled for it?
Yeah, we controlled for age, income, and education. Sorry, income and education. We always controlled for it in the statistical analyses in the charts.
So it did not predict nurturant parenting?
You need a microphone.
I mean, I ask only because, I mean, as in terms of the comparison to hunter-gatherers, I mean, in our society, we have, you know, the worst income disparity, you know, for developed nations, and access to the ability to care for your children in an adequate way does vary.
Yeah,
quite
so we were
substantially from
controlling for
families
that.
and stuff. Okay, so you controlled for that, so that did not affect
Well, in the
the
mediation
relationship between
models you
nurturant
saw,
parenting and the other outcome variables.
in those diagrams of the mediation models, you saw them, what was predicting, but in the statistical analysis, maybe you can say this better, statistical analyses in the charts, those were all controlled for. Income and education were always controlled for before you got the significance on.
Yeah, we assumed that the income and the education status of the mother would impact this relationship, and so that's why we controlled for them in the analyses. I don't know if you remember when she introduced the sample, that it was actually a study of teen parenting, and then we had comparison groups of mothers who had their children when they were adults, but had similar education levels to the teens, and then a group of mothers who had waited till they were adults to have their first children, and then had higher education levels to have kind of a comparison sample in terms of risk, and then, you know, like a gold standard of mothering as a comparison group. So we kind of oversampled teens. It's a kind of an oversampled risky group. And so we controlled for the income and education to try to see how the relationships held without having to consider that.
So it affected nurturant
Yeah, that's, I think, what this would be saying, but I don't know if we
Thank
have
you.
any statisticians in the crowd.
Yeah. Here.
Samantha Gray with Attachment Parenting International. And you talked about mother social support, and I was wondering if you could describe what that entailed. Were you looking at informal or formal institutional policies, workplace environments? What was that maternal social support?
It was a mother self-report of, well, we had 2 different measures. Both of them get at kind of instrumental support, financial support, and emotional support from her family. Her mother, the baby's father, her best friend, another caring person.
Last question, I guess.
Joanna McNeely. My question is about play, actually. It has nothing to do with my personal
I have a specialist over
work
here.
life. When you were looking at play, I couldn't take notes because I was so riveted. But we're talking imaginative play. Like, so my son goes outside and he can, make the stick, the golf club, the gun, the jump rope, and anything else he wants,
We
versus
yeah.
other kinds of play.
We asked about a bunch of different characteristics. So it was about mother playing with the child and then other adults playing with the child. So we tell stories together. I can't remember all the items. Do you remember? It was a bunch of creative plays in there because one of our team members studies that. So it was just a general one questionnaire with multiple items and then a score on that.
And so the self-regulation that you were saying, that the play, the interpersonal play helped with self-regulation, how far out is that for self-regulation? Is that like for good?
Oh, interesting. It probably depends on what age the child is. So we know there's a high school in Naperville in Chicago that uses play to help literacy, or not play, but physical education. So people, they control what they want to do. They climb walls, whatever they want. They just have to reach a certain level. And then they've done experiments where they show that if you do that, I'll have all this fun physical experience before your literacy class or some exam, you get higher scores than if you have it after. So it's actually, and we know from other research, people probably know, if you get on the treadmill and then you try to answer or do something cognitive, your neurons are working better. It's actually facilitating neuronal communication. But how long it lasts, probably during the developmental phase when the brain is setting its thresholds. It matters, especially in the first 5 years for later. But there's all sorts of sensitive periods. So there's early adolescence. The college years are sensitive periods. Therapy is a sensitive time. You can remake yourself. There's a therapist, Jean Rossi, who argues that every 90 minutes, when the dominance of the hemispheres switch, and you can tell by which nostrils breathing more heavily, and the switch happens, your eyes water, or you yawn or something. And if you pay attention to that moment, you can actually, he uses hypnosis to help people repair themselves. So there's a lot of, he talks about ongoing epigenetic changes. So the early genes, gene expression in the different cascades, some take a few seconds, others take, immune response takes a little longer. When you go to bed, your different genes are turned on and different ones off. And so there's a lot more flexibility we have. We just haven't uncovered it in a way yet to maximize our own self-development. Thank you very much. Oh, Lorraine, did you want to say something? Oh, go ahead. Lorraine is one of our family staff members. You need a microphone, though. She's collecting data now. We're doing another study longitudinally from prenatal to 12 months right now, bringing the babies in and asking moms about what they're doing, watching them. Yep.
I just wondered about the cesarean versus natural birth, and what do you think contributes to the, was it self-regulation? Was that the characteristic? Yes. Okay. That was affecting? Okay. What specifically, why is there a difference? Is there anything?
Yeah, probably the biology folks could do this better than me, but I can tell you about another study where they, by Strova and colleagues, after birth, had 4 conditions. They put the baby skin to skin on the child, the mom's chest or belly, wrapped up a child, put the child in the mother's arms, wrapped up a child, put them nearby, or wrapped up the child and put them down the hall. And a year later, they looked at self-regulation. And those with better self-regulations were those that were put in the mom's arms.
Okay.
And then they also had a better relationship, according to their.
Because there are, having a cesarean myself, I had 2 experiences, and one, they didn't.
Yeah.
They removed the child.
Yeah.
And my first one, she was taken away and wrapped up, and not. Second one, she was given to me, so
Yeah.
that's interesting.
What happened?
That you
Did you find differences? Or
well, I can analyze
Tell
them
us.
for a while, but no. I'm
Sorry.
Thank you.
So there are other studies now showing, more and more studies showing different effects of cesareans versus vaginal. There's some stress hormone is something I hadn't heard of before, so I can't remember the name of it, but it promotes intellectual growth. That happens vaginally, but doesn't happen with the cesarean. Last question, I guess. Well, microphone, please. That one doesn't come off.
Oh. Can you hear me now? I thought the answer was one was cortisol simply by being squeezed on the way out. That was one of the main ones, but it also had to do with the microbiome picked up from the vagina on the way out, affecting the serotonin through the gut.
Although there's now evidence that the microbiome is affected in the womb, too. So the baby is not born pure like we thought. But it's time for discussion, so we can just keep going. But Jim McKenna's up here. They're going to come up and lead us. Thank you very much.